asked to give an overview of the various alliances that have been formed and reformed in recent years that has complicated America's relationship with the region in ways that has remained very unclear, both for policymakers as well as for lay people and the general public. And for an understanding of that, I think it's necessary to approach the topic from a kind of historical set of conditions to help us understand how the region itself was formed and viewed itself in its early formation, and how that historical experience has impacted its evolution into the modern period. The first thing that one has to comment about is the unfortunate fact that the Middle East, as we know it today, has oil, it is too close to Europe, it has too many geostrategic water resources, and it's been in conflict with Israel for over half a century. These are four factors that do not exist in this combination anywhere else in the world, and that I would argue sort of gives the region a certain, if not uniqueness, distinctiveness that has worked to its disadvantage. One would think being close to Europe is an advantage for commerce and travel and tourism. Having oil is an advantage, all the possibilities that you can do with all that wealth. Having these geostrategic waterways, whether it's the Suez Canal, whether it's the Bab el-Mandeb, whether it's the Straits of Hormuz, or even the Straits of Gibraltar and so forth, well, you would think this is an advantage. And I will argue that these have worked all against this region. Now, part of the difficulty begins with how did the Middle East and North Africa, as viewed on this map, come into existence in the form that it has come to. And the fact of the matter is that, except for Egypt, which has been around for 5,000 years, Turkey and Iran, almost all these others are all artificial entities that were the creation of outside powers whose territorial boundaries, as indicated on this map, are totally artificial and do not reflect the collective will of the people at the time that these states were formed. Now, this is not unusual. This is not unique to the Middle East. Virtually all of Africa, only Ethiopia and Liberia escaped colonialism. Otherwise, the other 52 states in the sub-Saharan Africa are the artifacts of British and French and Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. What makes this more than just a historical fact, however, is that it has to be compared to what preceded the colonial period. And how did the region view itself before outsiders came in and occupied and imposed their political, economic, and social wills? Well, remember, the last of the Islamic empires was the Ottoman Empire, of which this whole region going up to the border of Morocco escaped the Ottoman Empire, but this whole region was the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire. So identities essentially were Muslim. If you were not Muslim, you were also a citizen of the Ottoman Empire. You didn't have all the rights of a Muslim, but you had, if you were Christian or Jewish, you had under the Millet system certain privileges, which, if you're talking about a fairly traditional society, dealt with things that mattered to you in the first place. Family, tribe, village, marriage, divorce, inheritance. If those matters which were important to you were under your jurisdiction, under the Jewish millet or the Christian millet, you were fine having the Sultan being a Muslim. So to the extent that there was an identity, it was an Islamic identity. So in other words, if you were living in Amman, Jordan, and you were asked, in 50, what are you? I'm a Muslim. Assuming that you're a Muslim, or I'm a Christian. And I'm from Beit so-and-so, this village, and so on. You didn't say, I'm a Jordanian. And you might not even say you're an Arab, per se. We'll talk about that in a second. So, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, at the end of World War I, which of course had been penetrated decades and decades before, and was essentially receding in its scope of control. For example, the French occupied Algeria in 1830. The Ottoman Empire doesn't collapse until after World War I. So already, a whole chunk of its Western empire is swept away. The French come in Tunisia in 1881, into Morocco in 1912, and so on and so forth. The question of identity was essentially what we would consider based on primordial sentiments. Sentiments of birth, of religion, of race, of ethnicity. It was not of nationhood. So the Europeans, in the process of colonizing the region, came forward, of course, with the idea of controlling the regions for their own economic and political and military advantages, and they, carved out these entities to obviously advance their political economic interests. And for that, it was necessary, of course, to carve out areas that they would then agree which had which part of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, keep in mind that the whole nation-state concept is itself a relatively modern European concept. I mean, I'm sure you're all still quite familiar with the 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, when the beginning of the modern European nation-state system came into existence. It came into existence, and we're not talking about its viable dynamic. So if you go into the 17th, 18th century, and you talk, well, when did Italy become Italy? When did Germany become Germany? When did France become... You're talking about fairly late in the historical period. So when you think about the nation-state, you think of the notion of nationalism, you think of a concept of a modern secular state, which Europe ends up being, this is brought over to the Middle East in a totally alien environment, of which this whole notion is unheard of. How does that relate to my religion? How does it relate to my ethnicity? How does it relate to my tribe, to my village, and so on and so forth? But they had little to say about it. There were at least 4 different types of colonial occupation for the region that we're going to be looking at, and we'll talk about each one in some detail, or as much detail as we can given the time. The first type was what we call settler colonialism. The type we're familiar with in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Palestine, Algeria. This is where you don't just occupy because you want to exploit the resources, human and natural, for which you then have the necessary administrative and military capabilities to maintain and exploit the resources, but where you really intend to bring settlers in, occupy, and keep it for yourself. And in fact, this is what France did with the northern part of Algeria, in Oran in the west, Algiers in the center, Constantine in the east, were annexed into France completely. So they became part of France. So that's a whole different kind of colonialism. Now you're talking about the European colonialists who settled there became French. They were French citizens. They had all the rights and privileges that a citizen from living in Lille, Paris, Lyon, Nice, what have you. And in fact, at one point in time, the University of Algiers was a premier university in the French university system. That, if you had a choice between Sorbonne or Algiers, well, Sorbonne, the winters are so in Paris, I think I'll go to Algiers, the weather's much nicer. Albert Camus and others, went to the University of Algiers. The other settler colonial experience was in Aden. The British occupied this region in part because the Brits had a very clear motive in terms of their colonial ambitions. One was strategic in nature, the other was economic in nature, but if you recall, it was the East India Company, a private company that really established itself in the Indian subcontinent and created such an incredibly prosperous enterprise that the British government and the military had eventually to come in and defend it. So, in that sense, European colonialism really, in a full-fledged sense of the word, really begins with India. But the point being is that India becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire, for which its navy, which is what made it militarily powerful and enabled it to control that area, wanted to secure the passageways to India. So they systematically, it's interesting the places they chose, they had no real economic value or any value other than their location. Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Palestine, Suez, Aden, and the Persian Gulf. So you could see the logic of their naval considerations that they occupied the territories they did. The French didn't have this kind of logic. The French usually was reactive. If the British are doing one thing, we'll do something else. We need somebody to. Oh, here you go. Thank you, Ken.
Give you a little while.
I always have a student in my class, you know, wanting to read computers and always shuts off. So the first type of colonialism was settler colonialism, which was intended to profoundly alter the very nature of these societies. Now, Palestine, of course, is a unique phenomenon because of the Jewish settlements that come in, but you know, they were settlers and they came in and ultimately, eventually, of course, created their own state. A second kind of colonialism is the one that we've been hearing a lot about recently because of all that's been going on in the Middle East. Because all of a sudden, you know, the Sykes-Picot Treaty that nobody had ever heard about. Well, actually, it wasn't a treaty. It was an informal arrangement between the French foreign minister and the British foreign minister back in 1916, before the World War I is even over, before the Paris Peace Treaty is even signed, before the mandate system is established and all that. They've already said, listen, this is what we're going to do. You're going to have Palestine and Iraq and Transjordan, and you will have Lebanon and Syria. And then it was all formalized in 1921 under a mandate system that was part of the Paris Peace Treaty, which created Syria, as you see it, Iraq, as you see it, that became under the British mandate, and as was known then, Transjordan. And then the French got Lebanon, and they got Lebanon and Syria, and Britain got Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Now they had this was under a formal international legal arrangement that gave them control over these territories, with the assumption that they were not to colonize them as the French did in Algeria, but they were to govern over them until such time that the people themselves could be self-governing and they could then become independent. That was the assumption. Now, of course, for the people who were living under these arrangements, it didn't make much of a difference, you know. If you were living in Syria, for example, and the French were governing over you, you didn't wake up in the morning and say, oh, this is only a mandate. Thank God I'm not in Algiers. I feel much better. The Colonialists are acting really nice to me. You know, I mean, so the behavior, the attitude, the impact, the psychological, social, economic consequences were as devastating, regardless of what the formal arrangement was, formal or informal. The third type of colonial system was what we would call protectorates. Morocco was a protectorate of France, Tunisia was a protectorate of France, Egypt and the Sudan were protectorates of England, and here they were less formal than the mandate system, but they had the same intention. We will act as protectors until such time that the peoples of Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan can govern themselves, and so forth. And lastly, the fourth type of colonial was what we call special treaty arrangements that the Brits did with all the Persian Gulf countries, in which in effect what they did is they empowered what they believed to be the leading tribal family by siding with that family, and in return getting the rights to control those areas' foreign and military affairs. Again, as I said, the Brits were interested in making sure that their trade route to India was guaranteed. So for them, they didn't much care whether it was an archaic, atavistic, traditional, reactionary, tribal family that would take control over these territories. This is way before oil, so this is not, there's no real economic benefit per se. They were more interested in stability and their ability to maintain their control over the region. The only countries that avoided colonialism was Saudi Arabia. Iran is a non-Arab state. Turkey is a non-Arab state. And Yemen to a certain extent. So virtually the whole of the Middle East and North Africa, as we know it today, was colonized one way or another. This doesn't mean that foreign powers were not intervening or seeking to influence Iran or Turkey or the Saudis, I mean, especially with the American oil companies, but they weren't formally colonized in the way I've just described with all the others. Now, so think about what we've just said. A region of the world that is essentially existing as a legacy of centuries of a certain traditional, religiously based form of identity that is first and foremost very local, and more than that, primordial. Religion, ethnicity, village, tribe, family. And in a larger sense, of course, being within an Islamic empire. Then, virtually overnight, in stages, depending where you start, stages in the sense that Algeria was colonized fairly early, they are overturned in these arrangements, and an artificial, external, European, Western style of governance and authority and values and so forth was imposed on them. Again, having very little to say about their own destinies. There was no democracy, there was no accountability, there was no transparency, and so on and so forth. So it was inevitable that you had this incredible power imbalance, that you would have very artificial senses of national identities, since those identities and these labels were the creation of outsiders who did not even consult the people for whom they were governing over. As I said, Egypt has always been an exception. The Egyptian identity has long existed as Egypt, whether you're a Copt or a Muslim. But virtually none of the others. Even, just to give you one example, because it's so relevant today, when Lebanon was created as we know it today, it was really a really small administrative district of the Ottoman Empire in the Mount Lebanon region. And Lebanon is a highly multicultural, multi-religious area in which no single religious community has a majority. That's been its whole history. Maronites, Druze, Shiites, Sunnis, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, Kurds, Turks, you name them. They all lived in Lebanon, with a few on the Christian side, the Maronites, on the Muslim side, now the Shiites, but originally the Sunnis as being the dominant, but none of them the majority. So when Lebanon was given the mandate, they said, you know, this little Mount Lebanon region isn't viable as that. We need to physically enlarge it to make it more viable. So since they also had the mandate for Syria, they carved out the northern part and the Bekaa Valley from Syria and lumped it into Mount Lebanon, which is, so Tripoli, which is a major Sunni city in the north of Lebanon, that became part of Lebanon. The Bekaa Valley, which is dominated by Shiites and Hashish, was tacked on to Lebanon, and the state of the greater Lebanon was created in September of 1920. And the Syrians, of course, had nothing to say about it. In fact, the Syrians, since that period of time, since 1920, did not recognize Lebanon as an independent state and were unwilling to send an ambassador there because they said, this is still part of Syria. Finally, a number of years ago, they finally said, okay, now we'll send an ambassador to Beirut. Of course, these kinds of issues seem immaterial in light of what's happening. And the French also gave Iskenderun, which is Alexandria up in the north, this area here, as you see this line goes down, part of Turkey, that was part of Syria. And they gave it to the Turks as part of the post-World I arrangements. Again, the Syrians had nothing to say about it, and the name was changed to, because it became part of Turkey, Iskenderun. And then, of course, with the Six-Day War, the Israelis took the Golan Heights, which was part of Syria, and have not given it back. So the point is that these territories and these people have been at the mercy of external forces for, now we're talking about decades and decades and decades. When they finally achieved their independence, which occurred in stages, mainly after World War II, we began to see Lebanon and Syria in 1946, Egypt, the dates can be anything from 1936 constitutionally, some would say only when Nasser took over in 52, some say not until 56, but by the early 50s, Egypt is clearly has dominant. Libya is 1951, Tunisia is 56, Algeria is 62, Morocco is 56. The last country actually was Aden in 71. But the point is, from the late 40s to early 70s, one by one, these countries achieved their independence. Some peacefully, some violently. 8-year war in Algeria, 1 million people killed. obviously major wars with the Israelis and the Palestinians. But for the most part, believe it or not, it was more peaceful than violent in terms of how independence was achieved. Now, once independence was achieved, the assumption was, well, now what will you do about the question of identity? Now that we are in control of our own destiny, now that the colonialists are out, at least they're out in a very visible political military sense. They're not out in an economic sense. They're not out in the influence they've left behind in language and culture. And to this day, for those of you that know North Africa, it's French. I mean, you don't need to know a single word of Arabic, and you get along perfectly fine in Rabat and Casablanca and Marrakesh and so on and so forth. And even Algeria, which has had the most love-hate relationship with France for decades. And anybody who's at all educated, anybody that wants to go anywhere in terms of education and so forth knows French, and French is dominant. Well, of course, this is 130 years of occupation, but that wasn't the case in Morocco and Tunisia, where French is still dominant. So yes, they're gone. Yes, the countries are independent, but who are they? What's their identities? So the realization was that, on one hand, this region is viewed at the level of peoplehood as very uniform, mainly Arabic-speaking, mainly Muslim, and all contiguous to each other. So they're not separated by other countries and other nationalities. So on one hand, it gives a sense of, well, we have an advantage that few other regions of the world have. If you think of Europe, the European Union, all the languages, all the differences, and it's falling apart, some would say, as we speak, you would think, wow, they have a huge advantage. Plus, they can go and invoke their past. And some, of course, among the more hard-line Islamists, are going way back to the origin of Islam itself and saying, how did the Prophet succeed as he did to create the Islamic Ummah that was able to spread from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula within 100 years be in southern France? Weren't these Bedouins, weren't they tribal? Didn't they lack education and technology? How did they have belief? So this notion that it was belief, it was their religion, and their commitment to the divine will that enabled them to succeed. It wasn't arms per se, it wasn't technology, and they defeated all those that technically were more powerful than them. So this has become a template, a historic template, however mythologically produced and reproduced and communicated from one generation to another, that still informs, in the face of this identity crisis, a solution or a way out that is expressed most extremely, of course, with ISIS and those kind of movements. And you wonder, well, how can anybody identify with that? Well, when this kind of paradigm is presented, this notion of going back to the original caliphate and the success that it achieved, they totally misunderstand what enabled early Islam, the Ummah, to succeed, was the very opposite of what they argued. What made it able to succeed was the degree to which it was able to absorb and integrate and accept the diversity of cultures and religions and peoples that it confronted when it went east and when it went west. It succeeded because it required a basic commitment to one God, 5 basic principles, and then you could speak your language, you can keep other cultural characteristics, you can do. So it was easy to become Muslim. So the ISIS is presenting it as unless you're Sunni, unless you're Orthodox, unless X, Y, and Z, you're not following the Prophet's success. They're missing the whole understanding of that. But what it all relates to is identity. The fact is that what were we to become now that we're independent? So, given the time frame that they emerged, was a time, of course, of the Cold War, and the world was being divided in a very clear-cut way, not only ideologically and militarily, but economically and in terms of different pathways you would take. So these newly independent Middle Eastern states, especially the Arab states, were confronting simultaneously challenges of identity, of economic development, of political legitimacy while confronting what they believed to be the major military challenge, which was Israel, while the superpowers themselves were beginning to carve up the world to advance their own interests, of which the interest of the local actors were irrelevant, and oil became, after World War I, of course, it was very clear how important oil was going to be in World War II to seal the deal, and most oil was concentrated in the Middle East. And then because of the Cold War, the Suez Canal, as I said, these various what we call strategic choke points became very essential in the Cold War context. And therefore, there was an incredible amount of external interest in maintaining a presence, military, economic, political, that added to the challenges that these countries were facing at a time that they needed to determine who they were, what they were, and so forth. So as a result, you had the emergence of one-man dictatorships, more or less, that came to represent the political embodiment of what these countries sought to be. Again, we've got to be fair about this. It's easy enough for us to look back and make the kind of judgments after the period has passed, and you can see the successes and failures. But at the time, this part of the world, with other parts of the non-Western world, was essentially viewing themselves in similar ways. They had to overcome economic underdevelopment. They had to overcome their military weakness. They had to overcome their control by global powers, especially the superpowers. So the Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia that brought together Nehru and brought together Nasser and Nkrumah and all leading third world leaders to try to say, well, how can we escape this Cold War battle we're being sucked into, for which is hurting more than helping us. So this identity question was being approached in this multi-level, complex set of challenges that, at least it was believed at the time, a single man, a single political party, a single ideology would be the way in which, at least at the takeoff stage, that would enable them to move forward. So when Nasser, in particular in the case of the Arabs, came to power in 1952, he came to embody in one man all that they believed they could achieve and make up for all the decades that had been lost when they were occupied and when the world, advanced way past them. Bear in mind, remember that this region is not some, empty Pacific atoll. This is the center of civilization. Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. This is with great universities. This is with great cities and education. And in the classical period of where mathematics and astronomy and medicine and so on and so forth was passed on to us. I mean, this is fairly familiar stuff at this point. So the point is, they're looking back and saying, why are we so far back when we were so advanced at one point in time? And the explanation ended up being as much by looking at outside, which is understandable because they were colonized. Of which for them Israel was a continuation of colonialism, however misguided that view may have been, but this is what they viewed it as. And so someone like Nasser who came in and began to provide them with what they felt was really necessary was a more unified ideology that would fit the modern context and that would tie into the nationalist idea that was not prevalent everywhere. And that idea was Arab nationalism. This could overcome all the limitations that we have experienced by our colonial background, a failure to create, genuinely indigenous, politically legitimate entities, and we will all join as Arabs. Now, for that, however, you had to create common societies, common political ideologies, common economies, and so on and so forth. But almost from the outset, and this gets to the heart of these alliances, how did these alliances form? They in part are the result of the way in which the Arab world itself was formed. So almost from the very beginning, there was an Arab Cold War that at moments was a hot war that pitted two diametrically opposed interpretations of where the Arab world should go. There were the monarchies, who were mainly pro-Western, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, all the Persian Gulf. These were all monarchies. We're 1950 now, okay? And 52, Nasser comes to power, overthrows the monarchy here. Gaddafi comes in 69, overthrows the monarchy here. The monarchy is overthrown in Iraq in 1958. Several attempts to overthrow the monarchy in Jordan, unsuccessfully. Several attempts to overthrow the monarchy in Morocco, unsuccessfully. So you have, right within that context, conservative, monarchical regimes, most of them with oil wealth, facing Republican and increasingly socialist and in some ways revolutionary Arab states. So there was an incredible division within the Arab world itself that made it hard for the United States to determine, who can we work with best. Even today, it is believed that the United States, and specifically the CIA, because the CIA is implicated in everything to do with the Middle East, that we brought Nasser to power. The way it's argued that we brought Castro to power because Batista was a disaster, we had to get rid of him. Castro, he went to Jesuit school, he can't be bad. And it is argued that we brought Nasser to power because he turned, very much anti-American. But the point is that it was clear that the way in which political life was progressing, that the monarchies appeared to be totally out of date. Not only that, but in an Islamic context, that's un-Islamic. In the faith, it's between you and God. No one can serve as an intermediary. No one can speak for God. They can read the Quran, they can lead the prayer, but they can't speak. So having a malik is by definition anti-Islamic. But that doesn't matter. There they are governing over Medina, Mecca and Medina, and the whole, you probably have seen the latest articles and so forth on Saudi Arabia and the extremism that they have cultivated for many years that is now sort of, backfiring in a serious way. So, the United States, in this context, of course, was principally concerned with the Cold War. And this region was important in that Cold War. It was oil, it was Israel, geostrategic waterways, and containing the Soviet Union, which was under the Truman Doctrine, and then the Eisenhower Doctrine, and the Kennedy Doctrine, and so on and so forth. And remember now, this is all part of the Soviet Union at the time. So the Soviet Union has, historically Russia before it. Soviet Union had always wanted to warm water ports, the desire to obviously interfere in these areas and influence these areas. So these became America's principal goals in the Cold War. Make sure that Israel survived. Make sure we have access to oil. Make sure that we have access to these geostrategic points and so forth, and contain the Soviet Union. Now, who would be the allies that would share this vision? And here that was very hard, in part because the Arab world itself was divided. Now, remember at the time, and it was about the 50s and 60s and 70s, Turkey and Iran, this is before the Shah was overthrown, and Turkey was a member of NATO. Turkey was a very, very strong ally of the U.S., performed exceedingly well in the Korean War, and some would say even performed better than the Americans in terms of their military performance, and was a strong ally of Israel, as was the Shah. I mean, they had diplomatic relations. Here it was more, a backdoor kind of thing, but still very, very positive. And they also exploited the fact that the Iranians and Arabs, the Persians and Arabs, had a long history of antagonisms that go back even before Islam. So there's always been a kind of clash of civilizations between Arab societies and Persian, which got worse over the decades and decades, especially when Iran became predominantly Shiite, and also under the Shah. And the Turks, and of course the Iranians always viewed themselves as Indo-European. And for them, the Jews and the Arabs were Semites, and Semites are a lower category of people. So the Iranians always felt themselves higher. And the Turks also viewed the Arabs the same way, especially Ataturk, who tried to transform Turkey from what had happened under the Ottoman Empire, transformed the alphabet from Arabic script to Latin script, secularized, the only secular constitution in the whole Muslim world, and so on and so forth. So these countries were, and they were key because they both bordered the Soviet Union. So in that sense, and of course Israel was an ally, but obviously one that's confronting its own challenges, but they could depend on that. Now the question was, well, who are the Arab rulers on our side? Well, the Saudis were key because of oil, basically because of oil. And also because we were supportive of these monarchies who were conservative, who didn't want to promote revolution and so on and so forth. So Jordan was a strong ally to even to this day, Morocco here. The only real exception was Tunisia, because when it became independent, it got rid of the monarchy. And the founding father, Habib Bourguiba, was a very pro-Western leader who wanted to make Tunisia very modern. He'd been educated in France, he had a French wife, his first wife at least. He was very much influenced by Western and French intellectual thought and politics. So he actually fought ideologically with Nasser, because Nasser ended up being socialist, and he wasn't in the Soviet camp, but he clearly favored the Soviets over the Americans and so on and so forth. But that was the only exception. After Gaddafi came to power in '69, forget about it, Libya was a total wild card that nobody could figure out which way it was going. Syria was turning against the U.S., Iraq, and so forth. Lebanon had remained on the side of the U.S., but too small to be a factor. So we always had to sort of balance out these ongoing Arab Cold War conflicts in our goal to advance American security interests during the Cold War. So that meant we were only interested in relatively specific kinds of relationships: military, intelligence, and oil. We didn't care about their culture, we didn't care about their societies, we didn't care about democracy, and these kinds of issues that are so prevalent today. These were not our concerns. Now, let's be fair, these were not our concerns in other parts of the world as well. The Cold War defined how we would proceed, what we would favor, and what we would support, and military and economic needs were principal things. But the reason this is important is it's made the United States, it's left the United States in a very difficult position to try to relate to the societies as a whole, as the societies themselves over the years, up until the Arab Spring and even more, have come to express more profoundly what they themselves want their countries to be. The questions of identities are now being asserted, the questions of democracy are being asserted by ordinary people and so on. And in that sense, the United States has been left out and is only now trying to come back and influence and affect and relate via courses on Islam, Arabic language study, Peace Corps, and so on and so forth, even though those things existed before. But it was understandable. So one can't be overly critical one way or the other. As you can imagine, when it comes to the Middle East, academic discussion of the topic is, you're either Chomsky or you're, the opposite of Chomsky. I can't think of the opposite of Chomsky is. But anyway, you're all evil in the world that America caused, or America is the great exception and it does only good things. So when you have those kind of diametrically, views, it becomes really hard to try to understand that, in fact, those are the realities at the time. That's how we did it. We're now seeing that was inadequate, but that made sense because this was a period of nuclear threats and a period of mutual assured destruction and so forth. Now, as we proceed after the end of the Cold War, what never really happened was a serious reassessment of all the factors and conditions that had been taken into account to justify. Oh my God, what time do we finish?
8:10.
I want to ask a question. I can go on forever. Why don't we jump this quickly forward? Then the Cold War left the United States sort of uncertain about how, what are the issues and how do we proceed in the case of the Middle East, as in other parts of the world. You're all familiar with that uncertainty and huge defense budget. Do we still need that, and so on. And the Middle East was part of that. It's not clear how it evolved. Would it have mattered whether this ongoing Arab Cold War would have affected our relationship with Iran and so forth? Were it not, of course, for the emergence of global terrorism, that of course emerged much earlier on. You all recall the Munich massacres in 1972 at the Olympics with the PLO at that time. But at the time that was not viewed viewed in a kind of very narrow, exceptional, explainable way. But after 9/11, 9/11 transformed the whole way in which the world, and particularly this part of the world, was being viewed. And that's obviously a major turning point. And the other major turning point is the the revolts within the Arab world that began in 2010, 2011. Both of these are kind of, I would look at them as bookends, because they're all the result of the same phenomenon, which is the failure of these societies and these polities to have come to terms with what they are, who they are, where they want to be, how they're going to get there, and the continuous manipulation by outside forces to advance their interests to outside forces, which often contradicted with the attempt to resolve the identity issues at home. Thus the rise of an Islamic identity that appears to be authentic, results from the region, provides a uniform sense of collective identity, and has a very specific enemy, the West, generally the US in particular. In other words, with the failure of all the other ideological attempts to define and consolidate a political ideology that would give meaning to people's political lives, Arab nationalism went down the tube, Baathism went down the tube, socialism went down the tube, so on and so forth. In the absence of such an ideology, Islamism has filled the vacuum. Is it riddled with inconsistencies? Is it, does it really benefit the people? That's neither here nor there. The point is that it serves that which this region has been searching for 100, 200 years, you pick the time frame. As a result, we are now, the US, caught in this dilemma where these entities are themselves falling apart because they should never have been together in the first place. Iraq, we're mentioning about the Kurds, this was created even though the Shiites who live mainly in the south, the Sunnis who live mainly in the middle, and the Kurds that mainly live in the north. The Kurds who are distinct, who are Muslim but non-Arab, distinctive language, tribal differences within the Kurds. The Kurds are very different than the Arabs, and they're concentrated in southeastern Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, and Syria. And then you have Kurds spread out throughout the world, actually, some in Lebanon. But they were promised, by the way, after World War I, that they also would get, a homeland, the way that the Palestinians, the Israeli Jews were promised a homeland, and the Syria, Iraq, blah, blah, blah. But so this artificiality, the challenges that have been speaking about that were taking place during the Cold War, the unfortunate fact that they had oil and they were located where they were and they had these eventually imploded. And it's resulted in what we're witnessing today. Syria's falling apart, Yemen's falling apart, Iraq's falling apart, Libya's falling apart, and so on and so forth. So, Egypt's not going to fall apart because Egypt, as I say, has a long sense of identity. Tunisia's not going to fall apart. I'm really concerned about places like Lebanon and Jordan. I mean, there's nothing that says that they could endure very long. And Morocco is always also on the cusp of some possible upheaval. This has made, therefore, an attempt to create effective alliances for the United States with allies that it could depend on, very, very difficult, since now they are much more concerned with survival, stability, and fighting off what they believe to be more urgent challenges, as you're seeing between the Iranians and the Saudis: Shiite power, Sunni power, potentially nuclear power, oil power, fighting over, Syria in the case of the Shiites and the Sunnis. All this is making it almost impossible to create effective alliances, and I think the United States will have a very difficult time, and maybe should not, even make the attempt anymore to create alliances until such time that it determines what the purposes of these alliances are. We don't need the oil the way we once did. Israel can take care of itself more than adequately. Yes, Russia is behaving like the old Soviet days, but it's not, it might invade Crimea, but it's not about to invade anywhere here anytime soon. In other words, the challenges that existed during the Cold War, that forced us to ally ourselves with all kinds of likable and not likable so-called allies in the region, no longer exist. Therefore, do we need to maintain it? Is it not counterproductive? Does it not hit us back in a way that we witness in terms of terrorism? I don't know. These are more questions than answers, but I think these are kind of questions that need to be asked. The area appears to me in a very difficult, precarious transitional stage whose outcome we neither know how long it will be and we don't even know what it will look like given the severity of the conflicts taking place. Why don't we stop here, maybe ask questions or comments, and take it from there.
Fantastic. First question. With the backdrop that we're looking at here, incredible instability, what's going to happen with Saudi Arabia? That's like the linchpin of the...
Well, you've been, I'm sure all of you, I say that because you're here tonight, so you obviously follow what's going on in the Middle East in the papers, but there's been a lot of articles like this. Wahhabism, this extremist, fundamentalist Islamic ideology that is at the foundation of Saudi Arabia. It was in 1931 when Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, who was this fundamentalist leader, joined up with the House of Saud and created the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Okay? No consultation, no democracy, no votes, no anything like that. And imposed this puritanical interpretation of Islam that still very much exists today. And be aware, there is no counterpart to the papacy in the Muslim world. So there is no supreme authority who can speak definitively on key, either scripture, faith, practice. No. The Pope could one day say, you can eat meat on Friday. I grew up on, only fish on Friday, for those of you who know Catholicism. He says, no, now you can have, okay, then all Catholics begin to eat meat on Friday. There's no Muslim Pope. So, especially in the Sunni world. In the Shiites, there are Ayatollahs. There's a clerical hierarchy within the clerical class that has authority. So you have an Ayatollah who has authority within the Shiite community to which they would listen to. You don't have that in Islam. Now, most of the Muslim world is Sunni. So that's interesting about the Shiites, but they're the minority. So, what happens? Which means if you are fluent in Arabic, if you are fluent in classical Arabic, if you know the Quran inside out, and you can take those skills, and you can do almost anything you want with it. Thus, Bin Laden, then any televangelist can get on there. The Arabic language itself has a powerful impact, regardless of what's being said even. But if it's also being said in the context of knowledge about the Quran, you could take anything you want. Imagine with the Bible. The Bible is filled with all kinds of disastrous things. So you could take any of these things, and if you really know it well, remember, the Quran can only be in Arabic. So if you're an Indonesian Muslim, you don't have an English language Quran, as you have in the Bible. So you have to know the Arabic. Arabic's a very difficult language, and classical, which is the Quranic Arabic, is even more difficult. So not that many people have a full command of both the language and the text. Okay. So if you do have that command, you could take it any way you want. So you could make everybody, Jews are the worst in the world, you could say the Christians are the worst in the world, you can say that. And there's no one to counter it. Yeah, you could have some Islamic scholar at Al-Azhar and kind of, no, this is wrong. But he'll just say, I'm quoting text. And he says, well, that's your interpretation of text. This is my interpretation. But there's no pope that says, both of you are wrong, this is what I said. So in the absence of that, it does allow a strain of Islamic interpretation that exists in Saudi Arabia, funded by incredible amount of oil wealth, to spread throughout the Muslim and non-Muslim worlds, and has had an incredible impact, and I've witnessed it firsthand. And especially, remember, most of the Muslim world is poor. Most of the Muslim world requires financial assistance. Most of the Muslim world will always use financial help. When the Saudis come in, we'll build mosques, we'll build schools, we'll pay for the textbooks, we'll pay for the imams, and we'll pay for the teachers and so forth. Are you going to say no if you don't have the money? So the Moroccans, so throughout the Arab world and beyond, the Saudi influence and the Wahhabist influence has been incredible, incredible. And it doesn't differ very much from some of the most extremist Al-Qaeda stuff. I mean, it is really puritanical that most Sunni Muslims do not accept. And the regime is really hated by virtually the whole of the rest of the Arab world. And the Muslim, have you seen what they've done to Mecca during the Hajj? I mean, it's like Las Vegas. I mean, they've desecrated, for those who've gone and made the Hajj, you know, they've desecrated holy places to put, you know, Hilton hotels so that the wealthy Saudi princesses can have an air-conditioned balcony and look down at the Kaaba and do their prayer and then go back and watch TV. I mean, it's incredible. So the Muslim world is very, and of course, there's all the, you read about every time the Hajj, you know, hundreds of thousands of people die. You know, the Iranians didn't even send any believers to the Hajj because we don't trust you guys. You can't, you know, and so forth. So what do they have that enables them to do it? They have money, they have oil, and they have the U.S. The U.S. is the principal. Without U.S. military support, this country would collapse overnight. We made, first of all, there's 4 major American oil companies that developed the whole oil industry in Saudi Arabia. And so doing, developed all of Saudi Arabia. Now admittedly, Saudi Aramco is controlled by the Saudis. But the Americans still have an enormous influence on that. And the military. Billions of dollars of military equipment, intelligence, bases. None of it is public because, you know, this is one of the reasons that bin Laden justified 9/11 because he supposedly came to the Saudis when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and said, don't think of inviting the Americans to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. We, the Mujahideen, kicked the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The superpower at the time. We could easily kick out this petty dictator Saddam. Let the faithful do it. And don't let the heathens on the territory of Mecca and Medina. And of course you had 500,000 heathens come in. And supposedly that was the turning point. Whether it's true or not, it has had the impact of you know, convincing people. So, it's struggling to come into the 20th century, or maybe the 19th. At the same time, I mean, there is, for those of you who study Saudi Arabia at all and know that there is a middle class developing, there's an educated class, there are women who are well educated, I've met them, who are very Western in their thinking and even in their clothing, at least in the offices, and when they go outside they cover up and so forth. But that's a very small percentage of the population. And there's also a large expatriate community that's abused. I mean, all the dirty work is being done by Bangladeshis, Filipinos, Indians, and so on, that have no rights of any kind and that could be kicked out at any moment. And it just goes on and on. But I think the most important consequence is the one I just said about the money, the Wahhabist ideology, and the U.S. support of this regime in the face of the incredible amount of opposition that exists in the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world against the Saudis. Yes, sir?
Say a few words about Turkey.
Yeah, well, Turkey's on the news a lot too. I used to love Turkey.
The question I'm trying to ask is, you know, this supposed coup.
Yeah.
You know, that within 12 hours of its announcement, they had already rounded up thousands and thousands of intellectual, journalists, military people. I mean, this could not have happened quite that quickly. So it seems that Erdogan is trying to consolidate power, trying to eliminate all opposition. And my question really is, well, if he succeeds, what's going to happen in terms of the stability of the region from that point?
Very good question. Well, you sound and you seem to be thinking like a Middle East conspiracy theorist. This is exactly what came out immediately when it happened. So this couldn't have happened so fast. It happened, it was quickly rounded up, they were put in jail, and so he must have plotted it so that he could. But the reason that doesn't really hold is that he had already achieved all that. He had already consolidated power. He was transforming Turkey. I mean, added Turkey would be turning over in his grave if you saw what was going on in Turkey today. I mean, you know, he's a religious ideologue. He's got an enormous amount of popular support. And what has happened is as much as Ataturk transformed Turkey into a modern secular state, he essentially really only transformed the urban areas. He really transformed Istanbul and Ankara and the coastal towns. Most of Anatolia remained totally backwards, totally traditional, totally religious. As the country developed and modernized and the economy prospered and more people from the villages and the countryside moved into the cities, they moved into the cities, but they brought with them their traditionalism, their religiosity, their conservatism, and so on. So he was elected mayor of Istanbul, and so forth. So he does reflect the majority of what Turks believe. And for someone who's been going in and out of Turkey for decades, it's amazing to see how many headscarves women are wearing in big cities. And you always expect it in Anatolia, in villages and so forth. So the fact of the matter is, the latest phase, the one you're describing, what he's doing, is just sort of whether or not he planned it or not is less important, and it's a continuation of a process that he's been pursuing in closing down the press, opposition, kicking out professors and others that disagree with him, and making Turkey into another Middle Eastern authoritarian state, no different than the Arabs, which totally Turkey was. Now, for us, it's a huge problem because it's a NATO member. It's key to trying to resolve the Syrian question. So Erdogan is becoming like Putin. And Putin and Erdogan get along great. Trump will love these guys. I mean, he will be happy with. I mean, these guys are all, no opposition. We know what we have to go. And like in the case of Putin and in the case of Turkey, when they do have elections, they do, get overwhelming votes, and most of it is sincere, I believe it. So I think we're at a very dangerous point in